Hi everyone, so Kim here with Native Lady Book Warrior, and today I am going to be wrapping up some reads, some very much needed wrap up that I haven't done in a while. So this wrap up is going to focus on fiction reads, all the way from literary reads to romance and to historical fiction. So stick around and welcome, Vitsoave. Let's get started. So the first book I'm going to be talking to you about is an Indigenous read, and this book is written by Indigenous, Two-Spirit Indigenous queer author Joshua Whitehead, and this book of course is called Jonny Appleseed. Wow, this book is so fantastic. I came away from this book just having so many emotions, and this is a book I actually read pretty much in one setting, and it was completely fantastic. So this book follows a Two-Spirit Indigenous queer character named Jonny who leaves the res for an urban life. And in that urban life, you see that it's not only full of complexities, but also full of hardships. But this character, Jonny, takes you into his life. And it's a first-person narrative, of course. See this very interesting lifestyle that Jonny has and how racism feeds into the fetishes of those who are engaging in not necessarily survival sex, but sex work, but also the complexity of Jonny's dating life. I think what I also really enjoyed about this book is the tenderness and the love that Joshua Whitehead writes of Indigenous joy, but also Indigenous queer life and Indigenous strength. So, and a lot of that Indigenous joy and strength includes Jonny's grandmother or his kokum. Those parts are just so good. I wanted to give like a really good example, but I feel like the stories that Joshua Whitehead writes about are just so good and so emotionally descriptive, and the vitality that you see in those moments are incredibly strong and tender. So I'm not going to give any examples right now because I just really want you all to read this book. But I think overall, Jonny is one of my favorite characters that I've read this year, and his humor and also that native humor is on a whole different level. The layers of resilience that Jonny has and the perseverance that exists on these pages also simultaneously shines a very bright light on racism, historical and racist stereotypes that the non-Indigenous community may have against Indigenous peoples, but also all the different ways that Indigenous peoples are dehumanized in our world. And I know Joshua Whitehead is an Indigenous author within colonial Canada, but I feel like there are so many parallels there that take place also here in the lower 48. This book's conclusion left me with all kinds of feelings, and I reflected on them for a very, I feel like for a good length of time. Honestly, this book is just a serious must read. I gave this book 4.5 stars. It's such an incredible read. I suggest you all check it out. I recently purchased the physical book, so I can reread it later this year. I also want to experience this as a hybrid read. I read this first via audio, but I'm gonna read this pretty soon. I feel like whenever I read a book a second time around, there's always so many things that I miss. Yeah, so incredible book. Definitely check this out. Okay, so this next book that I read it back in December, and I can't believe I'm talking about this book so late. This book is a historical fiction novel, and it's so good. And that book is Beasts of a Little Land by Juhea Kim. This book is definitely my favorite read of December, but I think this book is probably my top read of 2021. And it is heartbreaking. It's gorgeous. It's beautiful. It's so wonderfully written. This book takes place in Korea over a span of about 50 to 60 years. And it follows several characters from, I believe, 2 to 3 generations and their descendants, and how they are all intricately connected. I don't want to give away some of the themes of this book, but I just want to say that that interconnectedness, or even that brush by of characters, is such a great element in this book, and it was so incredibly written. So this book takes place during a span of the time of Japanese occupation all the way to the Korean independence. And through this, you also see Korea making this transition from this old, I don't want to say old, but definitely a very cultured Korea. I mean, still cultured all the way through, but also modernity and technology and making its way into it. And you see not only how characters view this change, but also you see the growth, fall, and even the complexity of character development that takes place in this book. And that happens with both Japanese and Korean characters. You also see this really wonderful, I feel like, not only the growth or fall of characters, but definitely there's roles that each of these characters may have in the beginning of the book, but how that transitions, and it may either have developed, stayed the same, or what. I'm trying to really hard talk about this book without giving too much spoilers, but you definitely see a switch of roles, a switch of loyalties, of even fidelity, and the writing of the plot development, and then also the character development. It's just so masterful, the writing there. The characters include so many different types. So there's a character that starts out very much in poverty, and then also of a character becoming a courtesan and activists and politicians and soldiers. So the diversity of character background and role is very diverse. And I want to say that within this book, there is a description of a romance. And honestly, when I read that description, I almost didn't want to read it, because as you all know, I tend to kind of, especially last year, stayed away from a lot of romance books, but that romance is very subtle. It doesn't overtake this book. It doesn't overtake these characters. It definitely doesn't overtake the plot. But to me, it felt like a backdrop. If any of you have read that in the description of this book, don't let it scare you or deter you from reading it, because it doesn't overtake this book. I also want to say that the time lapse that takes place, that span of 50 to 60 years, is so good. The transitions are so well, they're very seamless. And I just want to say, for content warnings, on the top of my head, I remember for this book is graphic violence, ethnic racism, sexual assault, poverty, starvation, war, colonization, gun violence, sexual assault, addiction. So you all know I'm very big on wanting to throw content warnings out there. And this book, I think just because it was so powerful, I remember the content warnings there. So of course, I gave, according to me just blabbing about this book right now, I gave this book 5 stars. I wish I could give it more. And this book is a debut novel. Oh my gosh. And holy crap, was it good. I honestly can't wait until this author writes another book. I am following them on every social media source that I have. And pretty much, like, if their name pings, I usually just kind of look up. But yes, Beasts of a Little Land by Juhea Kim, 5-star read. Okay, so this next book that I read, I don't remember when I read it, I can't remember if it was, but it was sometime this year. And that book is 7 Days in Jew by Tia Williams. Tia Williams is a Black author. And okay, so when I first read this book, I was telling everybody that I think this book is a romance, and that's before I actually started digging into the romance genre. I haven't been having a good journey with romance at all, and I am DNFing some books, or I'm actually picking them up that I'm just throwing them back in the pile. But maybe I should definitely make a separate video of what I'm DNFing. But yeah, but anyway, I read this, and when I picked it up, people were telling me that this is an awesome romance book. By the time I started digging more and doing a little bit more research on romance, I found out that this actually isn't a romance. I feel like this book was probably a women's fiction, because when I finished it, it didn't feel like, in my opinion, like a romance. And a part of that was because this book had some serious dark topics in it. Point me in a direction of more to read in terms of how does a book qualify as a romance. But anyway, so like I said before, 7 Days in June is written by Black author Tia Williams. And I really enjoyed this book because of the characters. The characters in this book were not perfect, which I love. In a book, I love to see growth. I love to see character development. And I definitely had that in this book. So there are two POVs in this book. So one of those POVs is Eva Mercy, who is a Black author of a paranormal erotica romance, I believe, who definitely juggles so many responsibilities in their life. One being a single mom of a very awesome young girl, and another is also managing her literary life and responsibilities and deadlines and all that stuff. And then another element, but I really don't want to talk about because it was such a interesting layer to read about, that Eva experiences. But and that other POV is another author, another Black author named Shane Hall. Shane, within this book, people kind of label him as mysterious, but to me, I feel like he's just very socially withdrawn. Shane is also a very successful, it seems like, a literary fiction author. He is also has award-winning work. So these two have a very interesting shared past that no one in their author or literary circle know about at all. And their past involves some major traumas and also some unhealthy relational experiences and also violent. Honestly, reading about those parts were pretty painful. I suggest that before going into this book, you should definitely check out the content warnings for this book. And I enjoyed this book very much. There was growth to both of these characters that they had with unresolved pain, but also like miscommunication and misunderstandings that they've had in their lives. But one of the things that I really enjoyed about this book, and I think it was because of reading the dialogue and also how these two characters interacted, that I could tell there was some serious chemistry there. And the reconnection of these characters was a story that I very much enjoyed. And then I also like that the timeline within this book isn't chronological. There's some jumping back and forth there's some reflection within this book that I enjoyed. I gave this book 4 stars. There were some things that happened within the plot at the end where I was like, huh? But I think that's just because of my particular taste that I have within books. And also, I enjoyed the writing, but I just feel like it concluded a little bit too fast for me. I also wish I got more details about, because I really geeked out just hearing these characters talk about their writing, and it was like a really big part of them as characters, and I really wanted more of that. I wanted more of that that background and that foundation within these characters, especially when it came to their art. And another thing is, I usually don't like even I don't read a lot of romance book, but definitely within movies, I don't like the very, very fast insta love. But I feel like that wasn't in here because there was definitely a set history of chemistry between these characters, and the banter, the dialogue, I really liked. It flowed nicely. But once I started looking, like I said before, into the romance genre and how a book is defined as a romance, I thought this book probably isn't a romance, even though, which is interesting, it was marketed that way. So since it was marketed that way, I started calling this book a romance. Yeah. But anyway, I don't want to I don't want to get into a lot of that. Definitely, if you all have some BIPOC contemporary romance recommendations, definitely leave that in the chat. If y'all enjoyed some romance reads that y'all have read. I think one of the romance reads that I got from Bree from Lockbooktition is Catch Me If You Can. I can't remember the author right now, but yeah, that's probably one romance that I'm definitely going to be checking out pretty soon. Especially if they're a series. I love series. So if you have any recommendations, drop those in the comments and I'll definitely check them out. Okay, so the next book that I very much enjoyed, and first let me say a huge thank you so kunaa to Libro FM for providing me a free copy of this book, because this book was so excellent. I very much need to get my hands on a physical copy, probably once it becomes a paperback, because this book was excellent. It was amazing. It was such a great book. So I'm sorry, I'll tell you what the book is. The book is called Olga Dies Dreaming by Xochitl Gonzalez. This book is probably tied for second place for one of my favorite fictional reads that I read in January. And holy crap, this book is also a debut. The cover of this book, whoa, right? Isn't it incredible, gorgeous cover? It's excellent. This book, like I said it before, is written by Xochitl Gonzalez, who is a Puerto Rican American and a Mexican American. And this book takes place in New York City, I believe in 2016 or 2017, somewhere around there. And it bounces around between Manhattan and Brooklyn, and it follows the perspective of two siblings whose names are Olga and Preto. And a brief perspective that is also written through letter correspondence, which is the siblings' mom, and her name is Blanca. Gosh, how do I talk about this book? And I enjoyed every single chapter up to its conclusion. I enjoyed the supporting characters. I enjoyed the delving into the lives of these characters, which included their family, and it was just incredible. First, Olga is a striving and very successful event planner, I believe. And Olga has these very ambitious dreams of success and business and also status that she is striving for within her life. Olga is so smart. She's funny. She's street smart. She organizes basically chaos for a living, and she is very resourceful, and she does business for the New York elite. So Olga is such a likable character. I enjoyed reading about Olga, but also her brother Preto is an admired, very charismatic politician that is faced with issues of gentrification and messy politics. So this book actually goes, jumps and hops and skips back and forth between Olga and Preto, and their personal ambitions and the challenges that they have and that they come up against in order to meet those challenges within their life, or to accomplish those goals that they want within their life. Each character is not only faced with personal challenges, and the author very brilliantly weaves in there the challenges that they also have outside their personal selves, which include balancing relationships, family, their ties to community, political pressure, and also social ambition. And on top of all that, a mother whose reach is far but very strong, and with very strong ties to Puerto Rico. This book is filled also with a lot of cultural ties that I loved reading about, and that culture and the strengths of it is so rich. There's also very colorful, bold, supporting characters that grow and that fail, and also that become richer and more vibrant with each page that you turn. This book also amazingly paints struggle that is tied to the concept of colonial American success, and that we all as American citizens buy into sometimes. And yet we also at the same time simultaneously despise. I don't know if that makes sense, but this writing and these characters and the plot really write well that complexity, especially if you come from roots that are founded and blossom from social justice like their mother. I'm sure you guessed right now, this is also another 5-star read that I loved and that I enjoyed. But I'm also happy that there's also kind of like minor romance subplots within this book. But what I love about it is that it really focuses on characters and not the actual romance. So I thought that was another thing that I really enjoyed. I was really hoping, I was like, oh my gosh, please don't let this romance overtake this book, because I was loving the writing and the reading and everything so much, but it doesn't. It just actually adds to the plot and the characters, and it doesn't overwhelm or overcome character or plot development. So that was another thing that I loved and that was written really well within this book. Again, Olga Dies Dreaming, 5-star read. Y'all, I definitely suggest y'all check this out. It is such a good book. Okay, so the next book that I read is a very interesting book, because you're reading it and you think, wow, this is a fiction read, but then later on that genre makes such a sudden change. And I don't know how to explain it except for without spoiling it. But anyway, so this book I actually read for a book club, and it's called Crooked Hallelujah by Kelly Jo Ford. So this book starts in the 1970s, and it spans 3 generations of characters, specifically women, Indigenous women, who have relationships of mother to daughter, mother to grandmother to granddaughter, but it's a very succinct lineup of Indigenous women characters within the same line. So this book already begins with a 15-year-old Justine, whose mother's name is Lula, and Granny, which is the family matriarch. The older generation of women within this book are very devout to what they describe being called the Holiness Church. And this devotion is pretty strict. I think it's Pentecostal. I think until Justine's path is changed by a sexual assault. And then Justine adds to that another generation of Indigenous line, which ends up, and that person is Rainey. So Justine, most of the time, this book follows Justine and Rainey, who move back and forth pretty often between Texas and Oklahoma. So this book follows Indigenous character Justine and her unfortunate line of boyfriends and love interests, but it's following them in a way, instead of a positivity coming into their lives, it's more of them. I felt like there was a symbolism there of them not only jumping back between these geographical locations between Texas and Oklahoma, but also Justine and her relationships, her unfortunate relationships with men, and almost kind of like a jumping back and forth between challenges. And this book explores these 4 different generations of Cherokee women and how they meet struggle, how they meet challenges, but more importantly, This book, I feel there's some major themes on parenting and coming against challenges, and specifically one of those challenges being men that are unreliable and undependable. These women chase dreams and they chase a life that is met by so many oppositions when it comes to class and cultural challenges and the harsh realities that Indigenous peoples face, and especially when it comes to Indigenous contemporary life. I felt like there was a sense of understanding, especially when it comes to Indigenous identity and heritage, and that it doesn't always stop with culture or ceremony, even those things aren't visibly present. Some of the things that I've read about, especially when it comes to reviews about this book, is people were upset that there wasn't a whole lot of culture. And honestly, I felt that to be a bit racist because Indigenous peoples aren't always all their culture, or aren't always all their heritage or their language. Indigenous identity also very much rests in our experiences in contemporary life and also the challenges that we all share and that we all have. I found that to be really strong within this book, and I appreciated that within reading this. And I also love that this book doesn't romanticize the hardships of Indigenous peoples. I just feel like there's just storytelling happening here that doesn't focus always on culture, religion, etc. So I appreciated that. I also like that about this author, that the author doesn't focus on spirituality, even though Indigenous spirituality, identity reads are really important, but that isn't just all we are. So I liked that about this book too. Okay, so in terms of other stuff, I feel like sometimes I struggled with the writing for this book. I wasn't absorbed enough about what these characters were going through, because there would be like a severing with a chapter, and then sometimes it didn't fully come around to explore that. This book isn't also plot heavy, so if you feel like you're a plot heavy reader, this probably isn't going to be the book for you. And also this book is focused on not just reconnection of characters with one another, but also healing and how we define that to be. And additionally, there were some perspectives, or maybe a few in this book, that were so brief. And I wish that was explored a little bit more, especially these brief occurrences with these some of these POVs making their way into this book. And I was just like kind of crossing my fingers or kind of holding my breath that those characters would come back, but unfortunately they never did. So that was another thing that I wish I had more of within this book. Also, lastly, there is a surprise at the end of this book that takes place, and it was interesting. And I wasn't mad at that surprise, but because it added to the intensity of the conclusion of the book. But it was very unexpected, and I feel like very out of left field. So I know some people love those kinds of things, but for me, I was like, It was interesting, I think, because it was just so unexpected and it came out of nowhere. And for me, for those things, I feel like they need a little bit of buildup or sometimes explanation. But for you all readers who like unexpected things with no explanation, especially something as big as this, I was just kind of like, kind of left in question. So another thing that I liked about this book was the writing of intergenerational trauma that takes place. There's also a little sliver of one of the perspectives briefly mention boarding schools and how systems erase Indigenous peoples. And I wish more of that made its way into especially the development of the characters, as that would have packed so much in understanding these characters. But I also kind of wish there was more development between characters like Granny and Lula, but I didn't get a lot of that as well. Other than that, this was an okay read for me. I gave it 3 stars, and honestly, I'm looking to pretty much anything else that Kelly Jo Ford writes, so I'll definitely be looking out for another read by Kelly Jo Ford. So yeah, I give this book Crooked Hallelujah 3 stars. Okay, another literary fiction read that I read. This next read is just amazing. It's incredible. I read this book for Bree's Black Classics book club, and I'm so glad I read it. It was such incredible writing. And I suggest if you all can get your hands on the audiobook for this next book that I'm going to mention, it is so incredible. This is probably not only the best audiobook I've ever listened to, but this book's writing is also completely incredible. I'm just going to tell you right now, this book is a 5-star read, and that book is Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. This book, wow, how do I don't really know how to talk about it because it is so amazing. So this book, Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, it follows one character throughout the entirety of this book. And this character, it first begins the story in the South, in a Black college that they are attending, but there are some serious circumstances that change what has happened with this character that are very, very close to racism and also like power that is happening within this environment. And I don't want to say any more than that because I feel like it's going to ruin this book, but and ruin your experience with it. But then this character, due to unforeseen circumstances, makes their way to Harlem and very quickly makes their way to becoming a spokesperson for this organization called the Brotherhood. And there's all of these things that take place within this book. That's all. Those are all the details I want to give you because this book is such an incredible read. This book is a very challenging and difficult read, and I didn't know what to think at the moment, especially because there's some hard topics that are discussed at the beginning of this book. But I found this book and its writing to be so poetic, and it made me uneasy at times only because of how this book looks and writes about racism against Black peoples within a spectrum that advances with time passing with a specific character. The character within this book, I believe they are unnamed. Yeah, I think it's an unnamed character. The beginning of the book just sucks me in. The writing is spectacular. The narrative jumps sometimes are a bit, they're a bit jarring, but I feel that that jump is so purposeful and it's very much demonstrated within the writing of the thoughts and thinking of not only the narrator but also the characters around the narrator. And this book very much knocked me on my ass. The narrative curves so unexpectedly and powerfully that it blew my mind in ways that were new and poignant and just maddeningly wonderful. But the plot, like I was saying before, there's a lot of jumping or shuffling happening in that, but I feel it really works with the prose and the feel of this book. It also, I feel, works with the connectedness and the nuanced themes and discussion and opinions on racism that the author very much writes very well, and especially that exists with the unsurety or the almost, I don't want to say lack of confidence because, but I just feel like this character sometimes was unsure of themselves, and it created these circumstances that sometimes frustrated me. But when you look at it from a colonial racial context, it just makes so much sense, especially when you're looking at white supremacy and white colonial power. So I felt that within the entirety of this book, and definitely when you're looking at oppression and lateral violence and systemic racial injustices. And another feeling I had while reading this book, I couldn't help but to think and feel that there was always something that was going to be negative or unfortunate or horrible happening that might in the not too near future. But that created this unsettled intensity that I had while reading this book, because I felt maddened. It felt not confusing, but I just felt like this twisted, maddening feeling while reading it. So yeah, I gave, like I was saying before, I gave this book 5 stars. Y'all check it out. I don't know how to explain this book to you without giving too much detail, but I suggest you really need to make this book a part of your TBR sometime this year. Yeah, so probably one of the best reads that I will read this year. Again, I read this book with Bree in her Black Classics book club. She has an amazing lineup of books. I'll leave the link down below where you can find a list of books on Instagram, and also maybe even some links to past discussion that Bree has had. So yeah, definitely check out this book. Okay, the next book that I read is a romance. I read this book for Krusty Club Book Club, hosted by Chanel from Chanel Time, and that book is called The Love Hypothesis by Hazelwood. So this book, don't be discouraged by my review. It's just probably because I have specific tastes in what I read, but I'm not going to give up on romance. I'm going to try to find, because I've heard that the romance, because the romance genre is just so wide, I just need to find something that I enjoy. I almost gave up on this book. I almost DNF this book. I just pushed through because I wanted to participate and watch that video discussion with Chanel. This book, The Love Hypothesis, follows a PhD candidate named Olive, who is trying to convince a friend of hers that she's over this person and they're not in a relationship, because her friend has a crush on Olive's ex. While Olive is trying to convince her friend, she runs into this person and she just randomly kisses this person, and that person turns out to be Adam. Adam is a professor and very much a hard ass in the lab. And then later on, both of them, for reasons of their own, which I won't share because that's probably a detail you guys can read about, but for their own reasons, agree to be in a fake relationship. Things that I enjoyed were all within the setting of this book. I really enjoyed the awesome geeky science stuff. There is a little bit of mild humor in this book that popped up now and then, and how these two characters connect, which is through their professions and their love within that profession or science. And I really like that part. Their connection was more grounded on an intellectual level, which I enjoyed. I enjoyed reading about that part. And I felt like their romance was intertwined with that. I also liked the collegiate setting. I liked the exploration of the STEM field within and its careers and where those careers can go. That setting and that background of these characters was pretty refreshing, and I enjoyed it. My unlikes of this book, oh my gosh, the plot is so predictable. The plot, I was like, okay, this is gonna happen, just like teasing, because whenever me and my kids watch movies or any kind of show together, they kind of make fun of me because I'm always like predicting stuff that happen. But yeah, that is one thing I didn't like about this book. I know some people who review books say, well, that's just romance. It's predictable, but there's some elements that could be pretty unpredictable, I feel, when I read things. But yeah, the plot in this book is pretty predictable. Another thing is there isn't a whole lot of character depth with both of these characters, I feel. Adam, which is the love interest, the broody love interest, he was, in my opinion, a bit boring. And I found that to be surprising because I love a good brooding character. I love broody characters in fantasy and sci-fi. I feel like they add to a lot of complexity within the plot and just even banter and dialogue that takes place. But Adam's depth, character depth, was like 1 foot deep in a swimming pool. That's what I feel like it was like. I also had a hard time knowing what Olive looked like. I feel like in this book, there's not a whole lot of character description of what Olive was like. So I just imagined her as this fuzzy circle with a smiley face. I know that's stupid, but that's what I kind of imagined her as. And I kept just picturing these cartoon characters that were basically on the cover. I was like, okay, this is what they look like. And yes, what I heard was that this is a Rilo fanfic. So I guess I'm supposed to picture Adam Driver and Daisy Ridley, maybe when I was reading this book. But you know me, like, every time I give a book high ratings, it's because of character development. And I didn't find that in this book. So that's why I also didn't enjoy it. There's also a lot of repetition in this book. I think the only character description that I get of Adam is just how tall and how big this character is. I'm just like, big, huge. Okay, we know, or I know already that this character is tall. Why say it again? Unless it's referenced to something funny, but it's just, yeah, I just feel like that was just like a huge repetition. So a funny thing that happens while I was reading this book is every time the author said, yeah, this character's tall or big, I would add another inch to height within this character. I know that's kind of ridiculous, but yeah. Another thing in this book, the sex scenes, I was just kind of like, eh. I was like, Ray. I mean, Olive. Sorry. Also, I felt like, and I promise this is the last thing, I felt like the maturity with Olive, I mean, I think she's supposed to be a graduate student in this book. And I felt like that immaturity just sort of annoyed me. But that is just me. And I just felt like this character, Olive, and sometimes the other supporting characters written like they were in high school or like their first year of college. So that was another thing that I didn't like about this book. I bet you all are like, dang, Kim, you're just tearing apart this book. And I'm like wondering, should I just give up on the romance genre? Because I feel like I have more criticism for romance genre than I do other books. But I think it's just because I'm expecting a lot, right? But anyway, I gave this book 2.5 stars. There was parts where I was like, kind of like, oh, okay, that was funny. That's good. But I kind of just sort of wish I DNF'd it. That's how I feel. 2.5 stars for, or I want to say maybe 2.25 stars for The Love Hypothesis by Ali Hazelwood. The next fiction read that I'm going to be talking about is actually historical fiction written by Julie Otsuka, and that book is called The Buddha in the Attic. This book spans a pretty big timeline. It writes about women traveling together by ship, and many of these women are from Japan to meet their future husband and spouses, all the way to the same group of women being forced from their homes to the unjust Japanese incarceration camps during World War II. So what is interesting about this book, I'll tell you right away, is that it's written and spoken in first person plural form. Yeah, so you guys are like, what? First person plural form? So most of the time we are reading pronouns that are like we or our or us. So that is expanded through the entirety of this book. It's kind of like a collected voice of these women and their experiences, and most of the time they're unjust experiences within the United States. I saw that the author made this effort within their writing for this collective shared experience and their hardship. And it's very much apparent contrast to American culture. This is an emotional, poignant read. You read about these women and their hardships, their heartbreaks, and survival, and their experiences with racism and poverty and assimilation, and how those things affect themselves, their families, their children, and ultimately at the conclusion of this book, their entire community. So you see that these women and the nature of their circumstances that they come to, you see what they leave behind. It talks about in a collective voice, this is what we left behind. This is who we remember. There's also social commentary made not only on American people and American culture, but also on United States oppression. I think a part that really broke me in this book was when the parents, they started sharing stories of how their children would refuse to speak Japanese, and the assimilation that was happening with the next generation of Japanese American children. Also the racism and the bullying and even the violence that their children were suffering. That part just really broke me wide open. This book is a very quick read. The writing is also spare. There's not a whole lot of fat to this book. Actually, it's very trim. I feel like I wanted more fat in this book, so to speak. And now I am eager to explore a lot more writing, especially nonfiction writing that explore what the author wrote about, because it's all based on actual experiences of Japanese peoples immigrating into the United States. So I gave this book a 3.75 stars. And it's because I struggled with a couple of things. And one of the things that I struggled with specifically was not identifying with a specific character. You don't really see character development. Instead, you see a community collective telling of what had happened, but not necessarily character development. I don't know how to explain that, but I also feel like this book is so poignant. It's so heartbreaking, but I can imagine that there was probably joy happening during this time and successes. So I wish more of that was included within this historical narrative and this historical fiction, even when it came to these women's strengths and their resilience and even their culture, and how maybe that possibly could have balanced out with the challenges that they were experiencing. So this book was a very quick read. It was less than 200 pages. I had to put it down several times because it was a difficult read. And also, lastly, I struggled with the plural first person perspective. At the end of the book, sometimes it felt a little bit repetitive. It kind of at times took away from that collective voice because it was so repetitive and it wasn't specific to any character or person. But at the end, I ended up just kind of sort of mentally tuning it out to conclude the book. So yes, at the end of this book, I ended up giving it 3.75 stars, but I'm interested in reading what else the author has written. So that's a plus coming out of this reading experience. Okay, so the next book that I read is, I believe, a historical fiction. This next book is gold. It's platinum. It's a diamond read, a definite 5-star read. I wish I could give this book more stars. And that book is Cantoras by Carolina de Robertis. I am so happy that Audrey from Perpetual Pages, they recommended this author, and I ended up digging into what else they have written. I think specifically Audrey did a book review on The President and the Frog, and then I started digging into what else Carolina de Robertis has written, and one of those books was Cantoras. So thank you so much, Audrey, for putting this book on my radar. I also got a double recommendation from Sean, the book maniac, who read this book and loved it. And like I said, this book is a 5-star read. It's definitely going to make it into my 2022 top reads of the year, because it's just so good. This book, it follows 5 different women who are at the time of a government takeover by a Uruguayan dictatorship. And during this time of political oppression within Uruguay, there are very, very limited rights of the public. There is a fear that the queer community of this time is experiencing, and they're actually being punished for their transgressions as well. Then these 5 women who are Flaca, Romina, Anita, Malena, and Paz find one another just within this country, and I think within a specific city, and they meet and they end up carving out a geographical place and a location in a place called Cabo Polonio. I think that's what it's called. And they carve out this place for themselves just to be themselves. And this book, I believe it covers 20 to 30 years. During that time, these women explore their queerness, their relationships. They explore love and lovers and their community's hardships, their own community's spirit during this time. And also they explore themselves and who they are. Wow, this book, this book gave me everything, which of course includes, right, Kim, character development. It also included humanity and family dynamics and heartbreak and a core full of friendship and finding family and what it truly means to find family and what that process looks like. I also found that there is a dynamic and love and dislike and a push and a pull between these 5 women that was so authentic and sexy and beautiful and wonderful. And by the end of this book, I was in tears, and part of me was breaking, but part of me was also celebrating with these characters throughout my experience and read during this book. I also laughed through this book. I was like, I gasped and I felt like I was in that group too. I mean, not literally, of course, but the writing of this book is so intimate. It is so lovely. And I felt like I was there sitting in that circle around a campfire and just observing and smiling along and listening to their discussions and quietly like giggling. And wow, Carolina de Robertis's writing really brings you in. It envelopes you in so much emotion and humanity. I also liked how the historical pieces of this book isn't just slammed in your face. It's not info dumping. There's not intricate details where you get lost, but instead that historical experience is brought in through dialogue and their experiences, their family histories and their own histories, and also through character development, that the author does that so very well. And there's not a whole lot of explaining going on, but you are definitely brought into a time that these characters are in, and it brings out so much in them. I think that is all I want to explain for now, because I really want you all to read this. This is such a beautiful book. And again, I gave it 5 stars. I really enjoyed my time with this book, and I am looking for this book right now in hardback where it's not gonna break my wallet. So I've been looking for this book in used bookstores. I haven't found it yet, but I definitely will. You're definitely going to see that book on my bookshelf, and it's probably something that I really want to reread sometime soon. So yeah, Cantoras by Carolina de Robertis. Excellent read. So this next book, I am so excited to tell you about this next book because I've been waiting for this book to come out for a while, and it was actually gifted to me by Stephanie from Stephanie Bookish. So thank you so much, Stephanie. I enjoyed your gift so much. It's an incredible read, and that book is Louise Erdrich's The Sentence. Look at this cover. Pretty incredible, right? I don't know if you can tell, but these parts right here are actually beaded. I know from far away it looks like just triangles, but some of these parts are like beaded triangles, which is pretty cool. But anyway, so this book starts out completely wild. It follows a main character named Tookie, and Tookie is an Indigenous character, and she was just recently released from prison for committing a crime. I won't tell you what that crime is because it's a completely wild beginning of this book, and it wow. Yeah, but anyway, But Tookie now, currently, when you read the beginning of that book, lives her life quietly with her husband and works at Birch Bark Books. Yep, that I thought that was so cool to have the character working at Birch Bark Books. So if you don't know Birch Bark Books is an Indigenous owned store owned by Louise Erdrich. So I thought that to be such an amazing setting for this book. One day, one of the bookstore's most loyal customer passes during All Souls Day. So All Souls Day, I had to look this up. I recently found out is on November 2nd. And that character who passes is actually a white woman who claimed Native ancestry, but now she is haunting the bookstore. So I was like, whoa, this is a ghost story. So I kept thinking, I wonder, especially for the author, what it was like to write yourself into a story. And although some people may pin this book as probably magical realism, but to me, it felt more of a cultural read and with mild horror with the haunting. The writing in this book is good. It is stellar. It is a wonderful literary work of art, digging into the lives of these people who work at this bookstore, and it is pretty awesome. And also, I want to say that the culture in this book isn't just shoved in your face. The culture is very much a part of these characters and how they look at their lives, how they look at others, especially other Indigenous characters, and how they connect. So culture is very intricately braided into this book. It is very much written in a way where its culture is simply a part of our lives and us and who we are, rather than just being shoved into this book. And it's not at all romanticized. It is very I feel like some of those parts are very intimate and they're very well written. I feel like sometimes culture can be shoved into something in order for it to be labeled as Indigenous lit, but with her stellar writing skills doesn't do that. She makes culture as a part of these characters and not just something to be shoved in there. It's a part of their livelihood and who they are, and she doesn't have to info dump. You can very much see it within the character development and also within the plot. Sometimes there's a lot of beautiful subtlety that is lovingly written within these pages, and that include contemporary Indigenous life and humor and banter that occurs between these Indigenous characters that work at this bookstore. With this haunting is that it's not an intense plot that is meant to thrill or excite, but there were times where I was mildly becoming scared or fearful, not by the haunting itself, but the details that surround why this haunting is occurring. So I definitely fell in love with the book's main character, Tookie. I loved her so much. She was a character that was so human, with faults and loves and challenges. And I think it's just because I don't really enjoy a perfect Indigenous character. I feel like it takes away from the complexity of who Indigenous people are, who they can be, and the challenges that they experience that make them colorful. Okay, so before I close my reading journey with this book, I want to give some content warnings with this book, and one of those being that the pandemic is written about during this book. So, and the death of George Floyd and the protesting that was going on at that time, because Birch Bark is located in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So if you feel like something like reading about the pandemic would be too much for you right now, and too heavy and too close to 2020, then I suggest you give this book some time to read. And it might not be a read for you at this moment, but that is something that is also within this book. So yeah, I gave this book 4.5 stars. It was a wonderful read, a wonderful experience, and I cannot wait to read my next Louise Erdrich book, which will be likely very soon. So yeah, check this out. Okay, so the next book I read is an Indigenous romance, and that book is called Sweetheart Braves by Pamela Sanderson. And I just want to say first that I was cheering for this book. I was cheering for this book to be good, and it's just because my journey with these characters has been pretty wonderful so far, and I was just like, come on, yeah, let's go, this book is gonna be awesome, and I was cheering. But yeah, I had an interesting experience with this book. I both enjoyed it and I was both disappointed by it. So of course, my rating is going to be a little bit average of both. But okay, before I go on, I just want to let you know, in terms of spoilers, this is actually the third book of the Crooked Rock romance series. But what is interesting about it is this book, it follows certain characters. So I think what I have to say about this book, it won't be any spoilers for the other books that I've read so far, because they follow different characters within those books. And I think the only thing consistent with this book is how far along these group of characters are in creating and maintaining this Indigenous urban center within where they work at. And also there's one romance that is steadily probably developing throughout the first 3 books, and those 2 characters are Arnie and Linda. But I don't know if I'm going to spoil anything for them. Just because this book mainly focuses on 2 other characters. Within this book specifically, we follow another character whose name is Tommy Weaver. Tommy's focus within the center, he focuses on programming with Native youth and also the Indigenous Elder Program, I believe. Tommy is also a character that is trying to live a sober life and therefore avoids like pretty stressful situations. And of course that all takes a turn when his cousin one day just suddenly shows up, and this cousin is also trying to quit and also live a sober life, but it also brings so much complexity with Tommy, who wants to be a good family member, but also he still wants to maintain his work life where he is trying to do the best that he can in terms of work, his relationships with his coworkers, and all of that good stuff. So Tommy meets another character named Elizabeth. So Elizabeth is another Native character who could not wait to finish college and get back home to work within their community and also take care of their granny. So Granny and Elizabeth also have connections through Crooked Rock, through Linda, the director. Yeah, so it's really interesting that I found really cool within this book is that there's ties and connections that these characters have with one another. That is so that is so true with Native communities. It is such a small world. So for example, I recently started working in this new Native national organization, and I just recently got hired in the beginning of the year. And there's another coworker of mine who also recently got hired, and it is such a small world in Native communities. We actually like have families who know each other, which is which is so interesting. So during this story, Granny, Tommy, and Elizabeth end up working in tandem to achieve a goal that becomes just more and more complex, but it also creates an opportunity and a chance for Tommy to gain family and love and support. What I like about this book is that not only are you invested in what is going on at this urban center, but it also brings in conversations, specifically within this book, like the repatriation of cultural items and substance use, Native found family, and working for the finding and successful centers like Crooked Rock, and how centers like that are so important for Indigenous community and peoples within the urban setting. So what I was disappointed in terms of this book was that some of the character development of the supporting characters or the other POVs, specifically Elizabeth, wasn't there. Like, I wanted to know more about this love interest of Tommy, of Elizabeth, and her POVs within this book are minimal at that. I also love a dual POV, but I feel like Elizabeth's chapters were so sporadic and they weren't enough. So even though I was cheering for Tommy, like for him as a character, because he's such an amazing character, especially within the context of this urban center. But Elizabeth, I wanted to know more. I wanted to know more about Elizabeth, and I didn't get that in this book. I also thought that the conclusion of this book was pretty good. I enjoyed it, not at the last chapter, but at the peak of Tommy himself as a character and the internal conflicts that he had. I cried. Honestly, there's this point in the book where I cried and I was just like, oh my gosh, because it's such an amazing moment. But unfortunately, that moment doesn't happen with the romance. It doesn't happen with Tommy and Elizabeth and their relationship, but it actually happens other relationships that are strong and absolutely awesome within this book. And I'm not mad at it. Yeah, I feel like the romance wasn't that strong, but everything else happening plot-wise that is related to the Native Center and the co-workers under that center was so strong for me. So I gave this book 3 stars. If I were just to rate the romance, it would probably be like a 1.5 or 2 stars. Yeah, or something like that between 1.5 and 2.25 stars. So the romance for me suffered a little bit, but the characters within the context of this urban native center is what really pulled me forward in this book. Another thing that when I ended this book, I cannot wait to find out what happens with Arnie and Linda within this romance series. So I'm trying to make time to read the last book in this series, which is Crooked Rock Braves, which is book 4 and the final conclusion of this series. So I'm excited to read that. I'm just trying to make time. Like, when am I going to read it? Because I have so much books on my TBR that seriously need to be read. But yeah, I'm excited to read that book and I can't wait. This next book, I actually read this next book. I don't even remember, but this next book is an Indigenous authored read, and that book is called When Two Feathers Fell from the Sky by Margaret Verbal. I got a free audiobook from Libro FM, and I was having a hard time in the beginning tapping into it, but I think it was just because of the first chapter. I ended up also hybrid reading this book with the audiobook from Libro FM, and then I think I read half of it through physical, and then the rest I just read through audio. This book is by Indigenous author Margaret Verbal, and I was so excited to read this, but okay, we'll talk we'll talk more about that later. But anyway, this book follows Two Feathers, and Two Feathers is a young Cherokee horse diver. I had to look up what the heck a horse diver was. I had no idea, but once I looked up what a horse diver was, my mouth completely dropped open. And so I thought, wow, incredible. This book has to be an incredible read just because of what Two Feathers does as a profession, which is a horse diver. Two Feathers, also known within this book as Just Two, has close friends within this book, are close to or within a town or near Nashville. One of those friends is named Hank Crawford, who loves horses just as much as Two, and is also, Hank Crawford belongs to a high-achieving, land-owning Black family. Neither Two or Hank fit easily in this area, which is highly segregated. Also, I forgot to mention this book takes place in the 1920s, but during one of Two's horse diving shows, a tragedy or a major event takes place, and from that event, strange things start to happen within the story. They happen within this park. Two does her shows at, and there's also kind of like this zoo there. So it's kind of like this mini attraction area. And there are some things that happen pretty quickly, like ghosts appearing out of nowhere, things that are also happening with the zoo animals that are also unfortunate, that turn from bad to worse. And during all this time, On a leaf of the description of this book, it explains that 2 is dodging a lurker, but I want to say right now that that description is totally downplaying what is happening with 2 and this lurker, but just plain straight out, 2 is experiencing stalking, and she has a stalker. Understands that quickly that friendship and unexpected allies that she runs into will help her through the events that are taking place in this story. So I was so pulled in by this blurb and by the description of the book. But in all honesty, I will tell you people, I gave this book a 2.75 stars. Oh, yeah. And I think this is one of probably my disappointing reads. And things that I liked about this book, firstly, was I did like how some of the characters were written, especially that ghost native character and POV within this book. I don't want to go too deeply into that character, but that was a character that I enjoyed. I also like 2's friends. I also appreciated the historical details of this book and that backdrop. I learned quite a bit just reading this book, especially about horse diving, historical events of the people and the place of this time. Once I found out that a character in this book was a horse diver, I quickly looked up what the heck a horse diver was. I was like, what is a horse diver? Because I didn't know. And wow, I was so surprised. So I liked 2's backstory, her struggles, especially when it came to identity, race, and class. I also enjoyed reading about her roots and where she came from, how she grew up. So now to things that I didn't enjoy. I will say right now that this book had too many characters, and some of those characters did not develop at all. I at the back of my head, I was like, what is this character bringing into the story? Is it trying to say something about race, about class? But then that character would drop off, and then another character would come in, and I was like, okay, so how is this character involved in the plot? And then that character story wouldn't see it all the way to the end. And like I was saying before, what you'll always hear Kim say is that I am a truly character-driven reader. I was so excited by all these characters and how they were going to be involved in this plot and what was going on with 2. But I was also surprised by, wait, how is this character driving this story? How is this character involved in what's going on? And I saw some connections with tying character to place and tying character to that time of what is happening socially, especially in American society. But I also saw how the histories of other characters at one time may have affected another. But I was also like, okay, where's this going? And I feel like sometimes the historical events of this book competed with what was developing plot-wise. Well, like this book probably could have been separated into 2 books. Yeah, I struggled with this book. Another thing I struggled with is the plot is slow. Okay, if the plot is slow, that is totally fine with me, but then I gotta have character development. And I feel with so many characters that I didn't get that. The establishment of the setting and also the plot was slow. I struggled with it, and I feel like if I wasn't invested in some of these characters, I probably would have quit this one, but I saw it through the end because 2 as a character did interest me enough to finish it. That's probably one of the only reasons why I finished this book. So yeah, I gave this book a 2.75 stars. I almost wanted to give it a 2.5, just because the writing is good. Yeah, especially with like I was saying before, the amount of amazing historical reads that I've been reading so far, I was pretty disappointed, or not pretty, but I was disappointed by this one. So 2.75 stars for When 2 Feathers Fall from the Sky by Margaret Verbeul. Okay, I am gonna talk about my last read that I read, and this book, I believe it's a YA. I thought it was going to be just a YA contemporary, but I think for me, I feel like it's more of a YA romance, but I'm not sure. So let me know if y'all know specifically what this book is genred as. But that book is Tokyo Ever After by Emiko Jean. I read this book again for Krusty Club Book Club. It is a YA fiction written by a Japanese American author, Emiko Jean. So this book follows a character named Izzy Tanaka, who lives in suburban California within the United States, of course, and she is a Japanese American. And like all POC youth, Izzy feels like she doesn't always fit in, especially within American society, American culture. Izzy is also raised by a single mother. I think her mother is Japanese American or a Japanese mother, but I'm not sure. So Izzy, being the curious teen that she is, doesn't know who her father is. So she does a little bit of investigation and figures out that her father comes from Japanese royalty, and then makes the quick connection that she also is Japanese royalty too. The news breaks out pretty quickly. Fast forwarding a little bit in the timeline, Izzy ultimately then goes to Japan to meet her father, to learn more about her culture, her responsibilities and duties as being a part of the Japanese royal family, but also wanting to make that connection ultimately with her dad. So this book is fairly good. It's well written. I enjoyed mostly reading about Izzy's journey of learning more about her Japanese identity and culture and family and her roots, basically. I enjoyed the character's perspective of what it is like to navigate back and forth between two cultures, especially two cultures whose ideals and teachings and may conflict with one another. And I thought this was a cute read for YA. I gave it 3 stars. And I think I could have did without the romance. I wished, this is me as Kim the reader, I wish that romance developed more into the second book instead of it happening in the first book. But I wasn't mad at it. I was like, oh, hey, okay. But I don't know if I'll be reading the second book. I wasn't excited enough to continue this series, and I think that's just because I don't know where this is gonna go. Okay. Oh my gosh, I wrapped up 13 books, and I hope that this wrap up, I hope I edit it enough so it's not so completely long. But thank you all for sticking around. If you've made it this far into my recent wrap-ups of fiction reads that include romance, literary fic, and historical fiction. So I appreciate you all being here. And let's see, what emoji shall I give you all? Okay, so if you made it all the way to the end of this video, why don't you put an apple emoji for Jonny Appleseed by Joshua Whitehead. So yes, thank you so much, guys. Until I see you all next time, be happy, be safe. I hope you're all doing well, and I shall talk to you soon. All right, later.